Hi everyone, good to be with you today, and uh, really good to be with you today. My name is Mo. I'm one of the co-founders of Morta. We're a company based out of the UK, and prior to founding Morta, I worked with one of the largest contractors in the Middle East. Spent time implementing BIM-based systems on projects, and then moved to the headquarters where I worked with the chief information officer. And there I realized that despite our best efforts, a lot of our work was actually happening in Excel files. So the way we see it is today in projects, we rely on hundreds of disconnected Excel files and systems to plan and track deliverables and handover and so on and so forth. So regardless of who I am, whether I'm a design manager, a BIM manager, a sustainability manager, or a commercial manager or a QA and QC manager, I'm going into systems like the common data environments and like Revit and even like ERPs, for example. And I'm pulling data out of these and I'm updating requirements trackers or responsibility matrices or documents trackers and actual reports and so on and so forth. And that's ultimately a highly manual process. A lot of the information is disconnected, and it's very difficult to enforce consistency in the information that's being created. And that has a few business impacts. So, in the status quo, the way we see it is a lot of the um, uh, there's a quality issue in a lot of the information. So one of the key things is making sure that the information is accurate, that it is what it actually says, that it's complete, that it's consistent. So are we classifying things consistently? Are we defining team names and company names consistently? Is the information valid? Is it unique? So to what extent do we reuse this information? We see like things like requirements, for example, a lot of that information is duplicated across many supply chain members, for example. And then what's the integrity of the information in terms of the relationships between the different pieces of information? We're seeing that, generally speaking, we see that poor information quality has several business impacts. So the first is poor visibility. It's difficult to understand where a process is at a given point in time. The second is a lot of time being lost on collecting data, cleaning the data, aggregating the data, and creating reports and chasing up people and so on and so forth. There are a lot of risks that are introduced as a result of these processes happening manually, especially in many of these projects. There are many deliverables and there are many checks that have to happen. And we as humans can make mistakes, whereas machines, by automating this, have are just very well suited for these types of tasks. And then opportunities for improvement are being lost because a lot of the learnings happen on a project-based level and are contained or locked in these Excel files. Now, what we're seeing is people are starting to look to respond to these problems and to move towards more connected information and a better way of doing this than Word and Excel. And there are three different approaches. The first is dedicated solutions. So increasingly, there are solutions that will just build an online BIM execution plan or an online EIR, and they've been hard coded and built to do these processes specifically. The good thing about them is they tend to have a lot of the logic that in place that's needed to help you get started, but they tend to lack integrations. They tend to not be very customizable, and as a result, that hampers their scalability. And they also often don't really focus on the data side of things as much as they as much as is required. The second option tends to be no-code solutions, so things like Airtable, Notion, Smartsheets, Coda, Monday.com all arguably fall there. And they tend to be solutions that are highly flexible and as flexible as spreadsheets in many ways. but they tend to be horizontal in nature. So it's difficult to understand how to use them for the specific purposes that you may have. And they would lack the integrations, and they're not optimizing for project-based settings. So they're not very good at permissions, for example, and project-based settings. And then the third approach, which we're seeing happen on the largest of jobs, is sometimes people will, or organizations will build solutions themselves. And that, obviously, the benefit there is it's highly customized, but that takes a lot of time, that takes a lot of effort. There's a lot of risk in that. It's difficult to scale that across jobs. Now, where we come in is we provide what we see as something that's in between these three options. So we provide hubs that connect information, point solutions, and construction teams together. So we bring a lot of the flexibility that you would get from the no-code tools, and we combine that with our focus on construction, which then allows us to optimize for the industry. So rather than having separate information in Word and Excel, you can bring that into Morta. You can start with information management, and then you can scale it for a range of other use cases over time. Um, you'd bring together what would be in Word and Excel into one hub, and then the different teams can access the hub and get the information that's relevant to them. Equally, we'd link to various systems, as I'll talk about in a second. So just to break this down a bit further, what we provide has the familiarity and the flexibility of spreadsheets with the utility of a database. So you could create the columns that you need. You can define their names as you see fit, but then users wouldn't be able to make changes to these column names. So you'd have that flexibility, but then you'd have control over what the users are actually getting and the changes that they can make. And then the second thing is you define data types for each of these columns, which helps improve the quality of the information that's collected. So for the status, you'd have a reference list or select list that you'd be picking from. For the team, you do the same. For a classification, you do the same. And then for things like date, you'd set a date field. And for the container ID or the file name, you'd set as an auto-calculated column. That would help in improving the consistency of the information and the quality of the information that's being collected. And then rather than having many different files, you can have one file, effectively one table, where all of the supply chain members can enter the information, and then they can each see the information that's relevant to them. A lot of what I described here is what you'd see in many of the no-code solutions. I think where we really stand out there is we focus a lot more on the data side and the tables. The second aspect to this, because we focus on construction, we come with a lot of the integrations for the solutions that you would be using day to day. So things, for example, like Viewpoint for projects, Aconex, Asite, Project Wise, Autodesk Construction Cloud, they're all examples of solutions we can interface with and collect data from. We also make it very easy for you to get started very quickly by leveraging best practice templates. So you can be up and running within a few minutes as would be needed. So we have templates that are bringing together the experience of our collective community and that help you really get up and running as quickly as you need. We then have a few other features that we've been that are very important, like we've introduced Morta AI so that you can ask the documents questions. We now have chart views to enable you to get more insight out of the data that you're collecting. We recognize that you're going to need to export the data, so we facilitate exports. We make it very easy for people to see the information that they need and that's relevant to them with permissions. Data security is very important to us, and then we also provide very detailed audit trails. Ultimately, the idea is that these types of solutions, not just Morta, can be used to connect and track information across the project lifecycle. But this is our vision for the industry. This is what we're trying to unlock. We believe you start with information management, and then you move into things like tracking requirements, cost, carbon, time, or the scope of work, design and construction, or the resources required to deliver it. The idea is we make it very easy for you to pull data from various systems. So that could be things like your scheduling solution. It could be things like your common data environment or document management system, but it could also be your field applications, for example. And then this data can then be reused by these different teams for various purposes. You can then draw insight on this data in Power BI or in geographic information systems or in BIM, or even if you're building your own AI, you can get the data that you need into that. The most popular use case by far tends to be streamlining information planning and automating tracking. So the idea there really is that you'll have reference data, you'll have requirements and responsibilities, and these will typically be in separate Excel files, but you can bring them into Marta so that um, they can then be linked to things like a tracker for all of the deliverables across the different supply chain members, where they'd each see the information that's relevant to them. And that would then integrate with the common data environment and these types of solutions in order to automate tracking planned versus actual. That ultimately reduces risk. It supports in providing near real-time visibility and leading indicators for performance, and ultimately supports in automatically tracking planned versus actual. James Franklin from Kier, one of the, even though they're a main contractor, I think one of the pieces of feedback that he gave us applies to any of our types of users. And it's that they've always wanted to create a standardized and consistent way of doing things. But the problem is they have to deal with a mix of systems and every different job. And what they really like about Morta is the fact that they know that with Morta, they can track information across the range of CDEs and that they can integrate with various solutions as necessary. When organizations implement these types of solutions like Morta, really there are a range of benefits. The first is the reduction of risk and improving things like compliance. The second is saving time and increasing productivity from each of the full-time employees that work on the platform. The third is improving the consistency and standardization across the different pieces of information, which then makes it easier to get visibility over the process and derive insight out of it. And then finally, increasingly, people are seeing the need to be ready for Industry 4.0 and for AI, and high quality information is a key enabler for that. We're seeing when it comes to compliance and risk, the platform and the ability to be able to plan information and track against that supports it in being used for tracking for client requirements, internal requirements, requirements that would follow some of the standards or the regulations, or even the ones coming out of financiers and insurers. And when it comes to saving time, ultimately we're seeing that at least a day a week can be saved because we can check the data quality, we can collect and extract data and eliminate any of the manual tasks in relation to that. We remove the need for emailing and notifying people and from producing reports. And one of our customers, Glenn, really what he valued is Morta enables them to automatically track planned versus actual. And they found that that helps them in ensuring that their projects are successful. There are a range of teams that are using the platform, from asset owners to main contractors to multidisciplinary design firms and specialists. I think uh, What that ultimately means is that everyone is pulling in the same direction. Even though we're a really flexible solution, everyone is focused on achieving very similar things ultimately, and that we have an understanding of the different parties that our clients would have to interface with because we're working with all of them. A few interesting stories. The Ministry of Justice here in the UK, really their vision was to create a connected approach to managing organization, asset, and project information. They've supported that, and they've been able to achieve consistency and visibility across their programs. One of the interesting things is they found that a lot of their requirements are duplicated across different types of prisons. And they've been able to reduce the number of requirements that they manage by 85% using a database approach because they no longer needed to duplicate these requirements. And then they've been able to automate tracking across many instances of Viewpoint, which supports them in understanding the performance of the different projects. Kier, which is one of the largest main contractors here in the UK, is using us to streamline delivery planning, and it's automated and automating tracking. So they wanted to create a standardized approach for information delivery planning and tracking that would be system agnostic, and they were able to do that with Morta, which has given them visibility on supply chain performance, and as a result, is saving them time from the work that they had to do in relation to data wrangling previously, and it's giving them automated assurance for compliance against the client requirements so that they have the confidence that they're delivering everything as they are required. And you can see that they're creating things like dashboards that give them more insight from this data. Mott MacDonald is using us on one of the largest projects in North America from an infrastructure perspective, and they wanted to create a more scalable approach than creating their own custom solution as they had done for HS2. And they found that creating a process on Morta would give them more control and would therefore be more scalable. And they've really benefited from the ability to use Morta's audit trails to understand how their information evolved over time. So what was the information delivery plan like in that specific week versus now? And they were able to understand the progress of how the information was developed. Now, the biggest learning point I would say is we've seen that organizations need to take a step-by-step approach to implementing these types of solutions. So we often suggest starting with things like CDE reporting and data audits. And we can support MDA because the one-click integrations make it very easy for that to happen. You can then add things like information requirements and execution plans, which takes your audits to the next level because you start connecting to the reference data, for example. And then you can go from there into information delivery planning. In information delivery planning, we see there are various stages of implementation that can be catered for. And then beyond that, you go into other information management resources, and over time, you work towards data-led project delivery. So I hope you've found this useful. Thanks a lot for listening, and thanks for taking the time today. And thanks to the BIM Coordinator Summit for having me.